That sentence threatened everything that I had been using to survive. It suggested that happiness wasn't something I had to earn or justify or postpone. And it suggested that what I wanted for my life wasn't reckless, it was informative. And I didn't want to hear that. I really didn't at the time. Even now, I'm just like, oh God, that conversation was so necessary and so difficult. But eventually, I realized I couldn't keep living a life that I didn't actually believe in or want to be a part of. Welcome to The Intimate Philosopher, where philosophy meets intimacy and life's biggest questions finally feel at home. I'm Dr. Emma Smith. I'm a licensed professional counselor, certified sex therapist, and existential philosophy nerd, inviting you to join me for an after-hours conversation. This is a space to slow down, pour a glass of wine, or maybe a cup of tea, and explore the messy, beautiful intersections of meaning, connection, desire, and being fully human. This is the place for real conversations about the parts of life that don't fit neatly into a box. So grab your glass, get comfy, and let's dive in. Hi, friends. I was thinking about it, and somewhere along the way, I think we've learned to measure our worth by our output, especially as women. It's, in our promotions and deadlines and the perfectly color-coded calendar that somebody has had a chance to not only use their best handwriting in, but also decorate. I mean, it's just a lot. We've learned that ambition means more, and that in a lot of ways, that rest is something that you can earn later, But at the same time, I'm curious, what happens when, because this is what's happening a lot in the work and in the people that I'm seeing in my practice. And so I'm thinking that this will be relevant for you all as well, that, people build the life that they think that they want, and then they realize, I think, that they've become a supporting character in their own story instead of the star. And, when the person who has it all together on paper feels disconnected from her body and her partner and her own joy, this is if you'll allow me to be a little melodramatic for a second, this is kind of the heartbreak of the woman who has set her sights so high and gone after what she wants. And yet the payout for having been so ambitious is kind of this lackluster reward at the end of a painfully long road that leaves a lot of people thinking, wow, I should be happier than this. And so today I want to talk about the myth that success and intimacy can't coexist, and what it really means to want both. Now, if you get nothing else from my podcast, I hope you know that I am a huge fan of the people that I work with. I work with women who are brilliant and accomplished and capable and exhausted. They have mastered achievement, but a lot of times I think that in the process of doing that work, of becoming who they have set out to become, they've forgotten how to receive. And they crave depth, but in some ways feel trapped by their own competence. And it's not because they don't love their partners or their work. It's because I think that they've learned to survive and achieve by tightening and controlling and performing. And so the question becomes, how can we stay ambitious and open? And how can we stay powerful and soft? And how can we stay driven and deeply connected? Because here's something that I don't want. I don't want to suggest that you can't have a career and that you can't go after the things that you actually want. That is the moral of this podcast episode, is not lower your standards. No, fuck that. Absolutely not. It's how do we recalibrate so that we can have the ambition and also the openness? Before we keep going, I do want to share something that has helped me stay grounded while I build and create. And that is my inner circle, which is a newsletter that I send out twice a month ish. And it is a quiet, kind of thoughtful space for people who crave more depth, less noise. And you can join at soliloquy.co/vault. That is SOLILOQUIE.co/vault. It's in the show notes. And then you can have that nice little delivery to your inbox. Okay, now back to our conversation. So there's this idea floating around that's kind of central to this whole thing, which is the idea of quote unquote having it all. And the fairy tale says you can have it all. And then I think that our culture responds and says, no, you can't have it all. And I don't actually think that having it all is actually the problem. I mean, we can even talk about the words, right? What does it mean to have? And what do we mean by all? And if you're like me and you saw Zoolander, all of a sudden this image of Benedict Cumberbatch may have just appeared in your mind where he plays the supermodel all. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. It is not worth looking up. If you do know what I'm talking about, please enjoy this pop culture reference. Okay, so I don't think that either one of those things is the problem. I don't think that the idea that we want the things that we want is the problem. I think the problem is that we feel compelled to buy into a story that doesn't take into account the context of our lives, that we're going to wake up in the morning and have 24 hours, the same as everybody else, except it's not actually 24 hours. It's probably somewhere between 12 and 15. If you can take into consideration the idea that you're probably sleeping somewhere between 6 and 8 hours a night. You have a wake up routine. You have a, sleep and wind down routine. A couple of those hours, you are probably consumed with other tasks that are beyond your control and capacity. You have pickup lines and drop off lines for schools. If you have kids, you are probably a child, a sibling, a friend, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's not like you have 24 hours a day to create this massive life. And the problem is that when we buy into this idea of having it all, I think we actually think we have more time than we actually do. Here's the other thing is that we also have productivity culture, which teaches us that emotions are distractions and not data. And then at the same time, intimacy in our lives and in our relationships and with ourselves often requires a pace that ambition tends to resist, because intimacy requires slowness to cultivate presence and patience and curiosity. And so when you're always kind of chasing the next thing, I think it can be tempting to forget to arrive in the life that you've already built. And in that regard, sometimes the bravest and gutsiest thing you can do isn't to just push harder. It's to actually pause and lean into the good mornings and the slow nights spent in. I mean, what would it look like if your capacity to slow down for love and intimacy was actually part of what made you successful and not a threat to your success? I want to go back to that statement I mentioned earlier of, should I be happier than this? For a long time, when people would ask me, are you happy? I had an answer ready. I'd just smile and I'd say something like, happiness and I have a complicated relationship. It sounded thoughtful, maybe sophisticated even, probably more like smug. Regardless of how it sounded, it wasn't true. At the time, I was in this phase of life where my life made so much sense on paper. I was capable, responsible, high functioning, even high performing. I had a relationship. I had a dog, a home. I mean, from the outside, everything looked fine. Internally, though, I was miserable and I knew it. But admitting it felt dangerous. Maybe you understand that. I mean, because if I admitted that I wasn't happy, I would have to face the fact that I had made choices in my personal life and in my relationships that had taken me really far off the path that I thought I was on and the one that I wanted to be on. And the truth was that I didn't know how to undo that mess without making an even bigger one. So I avoided the question. And I told myself that happiness was optional, that desire was impractical, and that wanting more or different was indulgent. I mean, what was the point of naming my unhappiness if it meant that I had to dismantle a life that, for better or worse, I had worked really hard to build? And so I stayed quiet and I stayed functional and I stayed disconnected from so many people. And then one day, a dear friend was talking to me on the phone and she said very simply, "I believe that you deserve to be brilliantly happy." And you know what my reaction was? I got pissed. I don't think I actually expressed it, but I did get off the phone pretty quickly after that. And I was angry, not because she was wrong, but because I think part of me knew that she was right. And I didn't want to be called out because that sentence threatened everything that I had been using to survive. It suggested that happiness wasn't something I had to earn or justify or postpone. And it suggested that what I wanted for my life wasn't reckless. It was informative. And I didn't want to hear that. I really didn't at the time. Even now, I'm just like, oh God, that conversation was so necessary and so difficult. But eventually, I realized I couldn't keep living a life that I didn't actually believe in or want to be a part of. And so I made a decision, and not all at once and not dramatically and steadily, I started undoing the mess that I had made. And it took years. I mean, truly, it took years. Now, granted, there was a pandemic thrown in there too, where things shut down and there wasn't too many pieces that were able to move. But nevertheless, it took a long time. And the only reason that I'm telling you this is because the reason that I am here today having this conversation with you is because someone named the possibility out loud before I was ready to. And maybe, if I'm being honest, if I had heard this conversation on a podcast back then, this story, I mean, truly, as I'm saying this, I'm like, I don't think I would have done anything with it. I probably would have turned the episode off because I wasn't ready. And maybe you are ready, and maybe you're further down the road than I was, and maybe hearing this story sooner matters. What that moment taught me, what that conversation taught me, and what I see over and over again in the women I work with is that desire isn't actually the problem. Avoiding desire is the problem, because desire doesn't demand that we blow up our lives overnight. It simply asks us to tell the truth about what we want. And for women who've been praised for control and efficiency and competence and composure, desire can feel really dangerous. I mean, we're taught to channel our hunger into achievement. And we're even taught to channel it into being desirable for others. But very rarely do we actually talk about channeling it into what we desire and our desiring. So, when that quiet voice says, I want more than this, I think we tend to treat it like a threat instead of valuable information. But let me say this again. Desire isn't reckless. It is relational, and it is data for you to use. It tells you that you're alive, and it tells you specifically the places where you can feel the most alive. And it also tells you the places where you've gone numb, which is why for my people, It's really about desire being this spark that says, hey, pay attention. I want this thing. I want this experience. And oh, by the way, I also don't have it, or at least not in the amount or the frequency or the intensity that I would like, because that's not how we express experiencing the things that we already have. If you already had the things that you wanted, that you desired, you would revel in it, or you might even become intoxicated with it. But we don't yearn for things that we already have. So that yearning, that desire, that want is letting you know that something is a little bit beyond where you're at right now. Before we continue on, I just want to pause for a second and say, if this conversation is hitting home, I would love for you to share the Intimate Philosopher with someone who needs it. Maybe a friend who is brilliant but burnt out, and you think that they are ready to feel again. And if you haven't yet, please leave a review. If this is helping you, any 5-star review helps people find the show when they need it most. And if this isn't for you, that's totally okay. Don't worry about it. Okay, welcome back. So we were talking about desire and how desire doesn't just live in our work or in our dreams. It really also does follow us home. Desire can show up in these really quiet moments in our relationships and in our bodies and in the places where all the things that we achieve kind of out in the world no longer protect us. This is where it gets complicated, especially for my powerhouse badass women, because it's one thing to want more out there in the world, more impact, more meaning, more expression. It's another thing entirely, though, want more with someone. To admit that you want the depth, to admit that you want the slowness, the intensity, and the connection that can't be measured or mastered, but has to be lived with that other person. And when desire moves into relationship, it stops being abstract real quick. It becomes very relational and very vulnerable and uncontrollable because another person is now involved in this process. And that can sometimes be really difficult for powerful women because we try to manage intimacy in the same ways that we manage everything else. And that's just not helpful in this because it doesn't relate. You know, in relationships, high achieving women, my go-getters, my type A++ers often bring the same instincts that make you successful out in the world home. And again, it's this idea of effort and mastery and control. And we end up trying to do intimacy well. But intimacy doesn't respond to that strategy. It responds to surrender and space. I have clients who come in and say this. I have friends who say this. I've said this. So many people have said this, where it's like you almost feel like you have to whisper when you say, like, I feel like I'm crushing it everywhere except here, except in love or in my marriage or in the bedroom or wherever it is. And, you know, the truth is that love and sex and relationships aren't constructs that have a pass-fail component to them. And none of these things are, unfortunately, none of them are impressed by how competent and accomplished we are out in the world. Love and intimacy and romance and passion and all of those things, they ask for something far more radical. They ask us to stay soft in the exact same places where we have taught ourselves how to stay armored. They ask us to loosen our grip and to let yourself be seen without the resume. Just let that sink in. It's not about any of that other stuff, because intimacy isn't built through performance. It's built in the moments where you actually stop managing the outcome. And here's the paradox that I think most powerful women eventually discover. When we stop proving how capable we are, we don't lose power. We unlock a different kind of power altogether, in particular in our intimate relationships. So, if you get nothing else from today, you don't have to choose between your ambition and your sense of being fully alive. You can be the woman who leads the board meetings and the one who cries in the car, the one who wants more and still admires and allows her breath to be taken by a really beautiful sunset, who builds and creates and achieves and stays open to softness and love and allows herself the time and space to be turned on fully, right? And I'm right there with you. For a long time, I thought happiness was something I would either deal with later or had opted out of because I made mistakes along the way. And even then, it was like, well, happiness is going to be something that I'll get around to after all the work is done and after things make more sense and after it feels safer. But the truth is that happiness doesn't wait patiently. And desire doesn't just disappear because we ignore it or tune it out. That question, that am I happy? It isn't asking for a perfect answer. It's just looking for honesty. And also, at some point we can talk about the fact that like happiness really isn't a fixed state. It's an experience. But for our purposes today, I just want you to see it as kind of this momentary check-in of being real with yourself, of allowing yourself to say what is true in the moment. And remember, intimacy isn't about balancing the scales as much as it is about integrating all the different aspects of ourselves and our lives into relationship with each other and into our relationships with each other. And remember that I think that success can often be hollow if it costs us our connection to ourselves or to other people. And maybe the deepest forms of power, not the ones that are valued by the world, like whatever. I mean, if nothing else, 2025 should have told you that our priorities are really messed up. But I think that some of the deepest forms of power aren't about control or even outward achievement. It's about openness. So thanks for being here, friend. I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for joining me for this after hours conversation. If something in today's episode made you pause, get curious, or see yourself a little more clearly, share it with a friend and keep that conversation going. Until next time, keep exploring that messy, beautiful space between meaning and being human. I'll see you next time.